Hi guys, this is DJ Funkatron here with a video tutorial to show how to replace the crossfader in a Denon DJ Prime Go with a Mini Innofader Plus S crossfader. It's a great little crossfader. It's nice and buttery, useful if you're into scratching like myself. But it also, if you've managed to kind of wear out basically the main crossfader, it would also work as a good, general crossfader replacement. I've got to give credit to some of the images here to Innofader as it's their copyright. So the total time it took me to do this replacement was about 2 hours, something like that, with all of the work involved. Bearing in mind that I'm a chartered electronics engineer, and I've been repairing sort of audio equipment of all sorts for probably 30 years or something like that. So it might take you a little bit longer if you've not got that kind of experience. So without further ado, let's crack on. So first thing, just have a quick look at the tools that you're going to need. So I like to use a set of surgical tweezers. They're particularly handy for kind of pulling out nuts and washers and things like that are around all of the control knobs on the front face of the unit. Needle nose pliers, very useful for undoing some of the connectors that you'll find inside of the unit. 1/4-inch drive handle, that's to drive all of these sockets and screwdriver bits. 1/4-inch in particular because the sockets themselves tend to be a bit narrow, and you can sort of use them to sort of get in all the nooks and crannies and difficult places. If you're using like 3/8 or 1/2-inch drive, etc., the body of the socket tends to be a bit bigger, so it makes it less useful for repair work. We've got a 6mm socket, a 12mm socket, a 10mm long reach socket, which is for all of the knobs and undoing the nut around the knobs on the front of the unit. And last of all, a number 2 Phillips, which is an extra word on that. If you're not familiar with the difference between a Phillips crosshead and a posi drive crosshead, these are the two different types. Just from personal experience, don't try and use like any kind of posi drive screwdriver bit in a Phillips screw, and don't try to use a number 1 Phillips screw, because all that will happen is you'll end up chewing out the inside of this screw and ruining it basically. And it gives you two other further problems. Is when you're trying to undo some of the audio connectors on the back, you have to put about 3 times the force in order to engage the screw to undo it, and that can kind of ruin the solder connection of those audio connectors. And thirdly, if you're undoing the screws inside of the unit, what it can mean is if you slip, you're putting an awful lot of force on top of that screwdriver, and it can mean that you can basically cut tracks, bust off surface mount components. It's all very expensive. You've got £100 crossfader that you're about to fit into £1,000 controller. It's just not worth the risk. So please use a number 2 Phillips screwdriver for that. Second set of tools, so this is like all of the soldering type tools. So you're going to need to do some surface mount work on this if you've got those types of skills. So you're going to need surface mount tweezers, which is these guys. Surface mount type solder, so this is 0.7mm solder over here. A nice water-based flux pen. Mine's looking a bit grotty here from years of use, but water-based flux is the best because when you use flux, it makes your solder joints nice and bright and shiny. But you can clean it off with isopropyl alcohol and stuff like that. It's very important that after you've used flux that you go and clean it off with isopropyl alcohol or some similar cleaning agent, because over a couple of years, if you leave it on there, it'll start to eat the copper tracks and do them no good. And last of all, a solder wick or solder braid. So this is what I tend to use in my home setup. When I'm desoldering, it's just very easy to use. It basically wicks up the solder. Once you've melted the solder in a hole that you're trying to desolder, it sucks it up a bit like a candle wick, and you just take it away and it just leaves it nice and clean. So that's my preference. So tools, I can't recommend enough that you don't just go and buy, like a 10 quid cheap, nasty iron from your local hardware store. Get a nice temperature controlled one like this. In the UK, they're about £30, something like that. And it will make the difference between you burning your PCBs to a crisp or keeping them, you know, as intended, unburnt. Okay, so if you set this to around sort of, I don't know, 350 to 400 degrees C, your boards will stay nice as long as you, you know, solder in a reasonable amount of time. Okay. Second thing, you need to be able to do surface mount soldering to do this. So if you are a novice, this mod isn't going to be for you, and you need to ask for professional help. Honestly, it's super easy to burn the board when you're doing this. And the fader in the UK, the Innofader crossfader, is about £100, so it's quite an expensive mistake if you mess it up. So if in doubt, or you haven't got the right experience and you haven't got a surface mount hot air jet soldering station, a bit like this one, which again, it's £30, they're totally affordable, get a professional to help you. It probably won't cost you that much, and all of the rest of the work, so beyond the soldering, you know, probably anybody could do, quite honestly. Okay, so let's move on. So first of all, you've got some prep work to do on the crossfader. So these drawings are from the Innofader setup guide. And what you can see is that when the crossfader comes to you, it comes to you in this configuration, which they refer to as configuration 2. Okay. And what we're looking at here, you can see these resistors here, they're going side to side. And in the configuration we want to move to, which is configuration 1, they're in the sort of vertical orientation. And it's the same with these. So if we kind of zoom in, so you can see the orientation of these two resistors is the opposite for these ones, which is what we're going to, and the same with the bottom ones. Okay, so in order to do that, you should use a surface mount hot air station. Don't be tempted to use what the instructions say from Innofader and just melt it with an iron, because you'll probably cause short circuits, break the resistors. They're really, really tiny, these resistors. They're surface mount 603 type resistors, so they're 0.8 mil wide and 1.6 mil long. They're like super easy to break. The best way, without any shadow of a doubt, is to use a hot air jet. Okay, so again, if you haven't got surface mount experience, please take it to somebody who has, and it will keep your crossfader in good order. In addition, if you need any support on this, I mean, I'm not being sponsored by Innofader. I've just used their products as a scratch DJ for a few years. They're super helpful. Get in touch with them, they'll help you out. You know, even if you're looking at this and you're trying to do this change on a completely different controller to the Prime Go, give them an email and they'll tell you which of these configurations it is that you're supposed to use. I mean, if you're really lucky, it'll be configuration 2 as it comes out of the box, and you won't have to do any surface mount soldering. So yeah, bear that in mind. So but next thing that you've got to do is lube up the crossfader. So one thing that I do, you can sort of just about see it here, is I tend to put a bit of heat shrink around the center of the delivery tube from the Deoxit lube, which is like the best lube for doing this job. And it's very nice that Innofader supply you with a tube of it. The reason for putting it in the center of the tube is that typically what happens is the rest of the delivery tube, when you press it up against the rail in order to wipe a bit of the lube onto it, it tends to disappear up inside the tube itself. So having this acts as sort of an end stop for the tube, really, to stop it from disappearing and allowing you to do a decent job of lubing up the rails. So when you're doing this, there are 2 rails, one on each side. So there's one sort of roughly there, another one roughly there. And what you're aiming to do with the lube is put the you know, the kind of the wiper of the potentiometer or the crossfader over to one side, and you need to just wipe just a very minimal layer, just enough so that you can see that it's just about got wet on each of the rails. Okay, you don't want it to be like dripping off, because you'll end up with you know, crossfader lube going to places that it doesn't need to go to. So it literally just enough just to see that it's got a little bit wet. Do the same on the second rail, wipe the crossfader over, and then do the same again, and then move it back and forward a couple of times, and that's it, you're done. It literally just has to be enough so that you can see there's a little bit of wetness on the rail, and that's enough to do the job. You might want to do that every sort of 6 to 12 months, depending on, you know, how hard you're kind of hitting the crossfader, really. Okay, so next thing, because of the glue mod for this switch, so this is the configuration switch. Okay, so later on in this, you'll see that you have to kind of push this switch when you're kind of configuring the crossfader, so configuring its cut-in distance and configuring left and right channels, that kind of thing. I found that the crossfader doesn't really sit nicely flat and level to the board. And my solution to that was actually to build up the solder on the pins. And you can see here, it's like built up like a sort of little pyramid. And that does two things for you. Firstly, it strengthens these pins, okay, so that when you're kind of moving the crossfader back and forth and banging into the end stops, you're not going to end up like breaking or straining the electrical connection on these pins or mechanically breaking them. And secondly, it acts as a standoff to the PCB. So by that I mean, once you've done this to the pins on this side, so you'll find that there's a collection of 4 pins and a collection of 2 pins on either side. Once you've done this to all 6 of the pins, the crossfader will actually sit nice and level to the PCB, which is exactly what you want. Okay, so this is how I've solved it. There are other ways to do it, but I've been doing this a long time, and this was the best way that I could find to resolve this particular issue. So next thing, whip the back off. All of the screws that you can see in this image are 2-point Phillips. There are a few of them that are marked with the triangles. There's one there, there's one there, there's one there, and another one there. You have to excuse my poor mouse squiggles. Basically, the triangles are showing you that these screws are in fact machine screws, which means that it's got like a thread a bit like a bolt, okay, rather than like a normal sort of self-tapping type thread like all of the rest of these screws. Okay, so whip those guys off. Next thing, you want to whip out all of the screws in the back of the unit. So to do that, it's again all 2-point screws. I think these 2 here are machine screws, that one and that one are machine screws. All the rest of them are like self-tappers. You're going to need the 12mm socket to undo the nut around these 1/4-inch jack sockets, and then to remove this part here, that's the 6mm socket. Okay, when you're taking it off, bear in mind, when I've been doing all of this, I actually had a deck saver cover underneath it, so it sort of protects the knobs from all the pressure that you're putting on. If you haven't got a deck saver, I recommend like folding like a bath towel or something like that up into 3 layers and then laying it on that, and that will kind of spread the load across the knobs. That's what I do if I haven't got a suitable cover. But in terms of removing this back cover, you actually tip this front edge up here and then slide it backwards, and then that will bring this metal cover over the tops of these XLR sockets, and the RCA connections. Okay, so once you've done that, this is what the inside looks like. So you've got CPU board, you've got an audio interface board, you've got the main control board, so all your crossfaders, channel faders, all the knobs on the front are all attached to this board. You've got the battery, and then this PCB up in the corner here, this is like the headphones board and Q and master and all that kind of stuff. And then these 2 pieces here, these are the mechanical connections for the jog wheels. Okay, so let's move on. So first thing that you want to do is make it so that you can remove the battery so the unit's dead. Okay, so we want to get to the point where we can remove this guy. So first thing you want to do is undo these 2 screws. When you undo those 2 screws, this board will kind of lift up, so you'll be able to lift this edge up. And then what you want to do is undo this connector here and this connector here, and then the battery will be completely free. So this part that you can see on the battery here is just like a thin plastic cover. What I recommend you doing before you're getting too far into this is take photographs of every step when you're inside of the unit. I can't stress enough, we've all got mobile phones, they've all got cameras on. Take as many photographs as you can whilst you're going, because it will save you bacon when you're kind of putting all of the connectors back in again, because you'll be able to see where they've gone. Now, I must say, mostly the connectors that are inside of here only really go into one place, but there are a couple of them that will catch you out. So one of them is a connector that comes in here. So you can see this black wire all the way around here, and that kind of plugs in over here somewhere. That can plug into this same socket as the battery, so don't get that confused. And I don't think I can see it in this picture, but there's a 5-way connector that can plug into this 5-way connector here, but is in fact empty. There's nothing that goes in that. And I think it actually plugs in under here somewhere, something like that. So be aware of that. There shouldn't be a plug going into that. And then this one coming from the main audio board must plug into the CPU board. Okay. Yeah, once you've undone those connections, basically remove the battery. The unit's dead. You can't short anything out or anything like that with your tools whilst you're doing any of the rest of the operation. So next thing, you need to undo all of the remaining connectors from here. So there is, you can just about see here, this is the Wi-Fi aerial, and it sort of whips around and then connects on underneath. That is basically like a kind of popper type connection, like you'd have on, I don't know, trousers or a shirt or something like that. Yeah, you just basically apply gentle pressure and it will just pop off. You've got this connection under here. If I go back, you can just see this is like a brown flexible PCB type connection. There's no mechanism to release this. It's just pull it out and push it back in again. Although saying that, you need to use your thumb and forefinger and just apply even pressure across the cable when you pull it out. To push it back in again, you need to leave about 3 or 4 mils extending from your thumb and forefinger and push it in nice and level. Okay, it will go in. We've also got this type of connector, which is like super common, you know, like Pioneer gear uses this type of stuff, PC gear uses this type of stuff. And basically to undo these, this black portion that you can see here, you pick it back with your fingernails or a screwdriver or something like that. The whole thing will move back on both sides by 2 mil, something like that. Once you've done that to both of these cables will just very easily pull out. They'll be loose. And it's the reverse to put them back in. So you put the blue part in first, and then you click this locking mechanism back in afterwards. Okay. Last of all, don't remove both sides of any of the connections. Okay. It's a massive benefit to you to have at least one end where you know that it's plugged into the right place, because then all you're doing is looking for one connection. So don't remove all of the cables, always leave one end plugged in, and always take a photograph when you remove a connection so that you can refer to it later if you can't remember where it went back. Like for me, I think I did this change over sort of 2 or 3 days. So on one day I did the crossfader surface mount stuff. Another one I opened it all up and dug it out, and then another day I soldered the crossfader back in and then put it all back together again and did the crossfader configuration. So it's really, really important to take photographs as you go in to refer to. So next, you need to remove these 2 PCBs. So the audio interface PCB, there's basically 3 screws on each. So there's 1, 2, and then 3. Don't worry about removing these brass studs. They don't affect the connection, so leave those alone. So you undo that, and then there's a lot of this type of connector underneath, and that's where you'll need your needle nose pliers basically to help pull that out of the board. One thing to say is that any connections that you see that go from this PCB to the headphone PCB, leave them intact, because what you should be aiming to do is to take this PCB out and this PCB out with whatever connections go between them all at the same time as each other. And yeah, just remove them at the same time. Leave those connections intact, because that's one extra set of connections that you don't need to change. To remove this PCB, another 3 screws. There's one there, there's one there, there's one there. And then on the front panel here, you just pull off the 3 knobs. And there are 3 crosshead screws, again, number 2 Phillips screws that you need to pull out. I mean, at this point, it's worth mentioning that when you're doing this, really you need kind of 3 tubs to store all of the bits, okay? This is how I do it. I have a tub for screws and nuts and things like that have come from the outside of the unit. I have a tub for screws and nuts and bolts and whatnot that have come from the inside of the unit. And then I have a third tub for all of the knobs, and fader tops and all that kind of thing, all of the plastic stuff that you touch when you're actually using the audio equipment, put that in another pot. It just makes your life a lot easier when you're kind of putting it all back together again at the end, to have everything separated rather than hunting through a big jumbly tub of all sorts of bits and bobs. So yeah, basically release all of those connectors, undo the battery holder, which is just these two screws, and then you're basically left with this kind of view after you've undone the headphone and interface board. So this board that you can kind of see here, this is the last piece to be removed. Don't do anything with this guy, it can stay in place. Don't do anything with this guy, that can also stay in place. So this is all like interface stuff to the screen on the front that you don't need to change anything with that. And don't touch either of these either. You can leave the jog wheels intact. They don't need to be removed in any way. So basically there are a shed load of screws in there, and you need to unscrew all of them, remembering where these brackets come from. So there are two earth bond brackets that go from the PCB to the back shell, so the back plate rather, of the Prime Go. Remember where those go, or preferably take a photo so you don't need to remember, so you can just see where they go back. So once you've done that, next step is to start removing the nuts that secure all of the kind of control knobs or potentiometers on the front of the unit. So one thing to be aware of is when you're undoing these, that the lubricant that they actually use on these pots tends to stick the nuts and the washers together. So this is where your surgical tweezers will kind of come in. It's, pretty easy to remove them with that. And you'll be using your 10mm long reach socket. It needs to be long reach just because this shaft tends to hit the end stops of like the shorter socket. So having a long reach one, particularly in 1/4" drive, is helpful because the recess here is almost exactly the same size as the 10mm 1/4" socket. And if you used a 3/8, it would be too big to fit in there. So do that. One thing to point out afterwards is that you need to leave this guy alone. It looks as if you should need to undo it, but don't. So anything that's basically like a rotary encoder, which is this one, and that one, there's nothing to undo with those. As soon as you've undone all of these main controls, as I showed here, the whole thing will kind of pop off. And essentially, if I'll go back, what you need to do is lift out. So this is the Wi-Fi aerial here. You need to lift out this side first. Okay, and then once you've tipped this side up a little bit, then you'll be able to remove this side and the whole thing will come out. Okay, so once you've got the main PCB out, next thing is to desolder and remove the original crossfader. Okay, so it's these two and these two. Technique I use when I'm doing this is using my temperature controlled soldering iron, holding the soldering iron flat to the PCB. You just quickly move between this solder joint and that solder joint quickly, and you're applying gentle pressure to the original crossfader underneath. And once you can see that the solder is liquid between these two joints, gently pull it down. And that's it. The pins will become free. Don't worry about there being solder in the holes. We'll deal with that later. And it's a repeat of the same process here. It takes a little bit longer because you've got more pins to heat up, but just work your way between them with the iron nice and flat to the board, not on a point, with it flat, so you're covering as many of these pins at the same time as possible, back and forth, and eventually all of that will become liquid, and you'll just be able to pull it out with gentle pressure. If you're having to exert a lot of force to do it, you need to keep heating. It should just come out with gentle force. Next thing that you want to do is desolder them. There are a lot of ways to desolder. You can buy a dedicated desoldering gun. You can use a desoldering pump. My preference when I'm doing stuff at home is to use solder wick or solder braid. It's pretty common stuff. You can get it at your local hardware stores or whatever. It's like 50p, and all you've got to do is basically place a bit of this braid on top of one of the holes, stick your soldering iron on top of it, and it will just suck all the solder out like the wick in a candle, only with solder, basically, and it will clean them all up and all be jolly good. One thing to say is that the pot that I've removed from here is an Alpha, which is a particularly good make, nice Japanese make a potentiometer, and it's very, very similar construction actually to the Innofader that you're going to go put back in there. So fair play to Denon, they've actually used a pretty good part in this case. So next you need to solder the new crossfader back in there, which you can see here. Again, temperature controlled iron, so you don't burn your PCB. You can see there's no black crispy bits on this, and that's what you get when you use the temperature controlled iron. Next thing is you need to fit the PCB in, and when you do fit the PCB in, you need to bend this wire mod so that it comes out next to this pillar. So this pillar here, this is one of the ones that was used to support the headphone PCB. And if you bend it round gently, try not to put too much strain on the wire mod and glue mod that's on the back of your Innofader crossfader. It should bend around and just about poke out by the side of this pillar. And what you'll be able to do in the sort of the last stages of this process, I suppose, is you'll be able to turn this on with, press this button, this micro switch with your fingernail so that you can do the programming of the crossfader. Okay. So after this point, it's just reversing everything that you've done. So whack all of your screws back into the main PCB. Then go and refit all of the washers and nuts back into the places that you've removed from. One thing to note when you're doing this is that it's super easy for the lube for these pots. There's always like a little bit of it around the bottom of where they're tightened onto the PCB. It causes the washers to stick together. So what you can find is you end up putting like 2 washers where you should only have 1, and you'll get to like one of the last parts in one of the last knobs in the job, and you'll find that you'll be a washer short, and then you have to go back through them all trying to find the one where 2 of them have stuck together. So before you put them in, really ensure that you've only got 1 washer and 1 nut, because that happened to me. Okay, so next thing, using your photographs and whatnot, refit all of the cables as we mentioned before, and take care with, in particular, again with this cable going across here, and make sure that you haven't ended up with a cable plugged into this, because there shouldn't be one plugged in there. Okay, it's super easy to get wrong. Refer to your photos. So once you've done that and you've refitted all of the knobs, again using your photographs to tell you which knobs go where, you need to basically prop the unit up without the back cover on its side like this. Now, the reason that you're propping it up like this is because the CPU board is only held on with 2 screws. It's really heavy, and it takes some of the strain off that board to use it in this way. So you'd also need a pair of headphones. You can see these are my ones plugged in here, and you also need a source of music plugged into the Prime Go, ready for the next step. So next thing that you need to do, switch it on. It's totally fine to switch it on. You'll be running from battery power, don't run it from mains. It's all good. But you do need to go to your crossfader console, which is from the drag down menu. So dragging this little icon down from middle will reveal this menu. And you need to move it over to the right, which is the kind of scratching, cutting kind of position. Okay. So next thing that you need to do is to change over the left and right sides of the crossfader, because what you'll find is deck 2 will be coming out of the left side, and deck 1 will be coming out of the right side. So as it's shown here, out of the box, actually deck 1 will be playing instead of deck 2. Okay, so we need to fix that, and it's okay. It's just a programming thing. So in order to do that, you're going to need to get your fingernail or the tip of your finger, if you can fit that there, on the end of this switch, and you need to start off with the crossfader at position C, press and hold that button. So it's not just a quick click, you press it and hold it, keep it pressed, move the crossfader over to the A position over here, and then you let it go. and after, I don't know, quite a short period, like half a second or something like that, you'll notice that the sound sources have swapped over. So deck 1 will be the left side, deck 2 will be the right side. Next thing, and you only need to do this step if you scratch as part of your DJing like I do. If you don't do that and you're just using the crossfader as a replacement crossfader, ignore this stuff. You don't need it. But if you want to start to change the cut position, for example, on the left side here, so we're saying how much distance it is before the sound from deck 2 cuts in, okay? Which for me, I like it to be something like 1 to 1.5 millimeters, something like that, because it means when you're doing crabs and things like that, that you get more of the sound for less movement of your fingers, so you can do it faster. So the way that you do that is you start off with the crossfader at position B, press and hold the button, then move the crossfader over to position A. And I think what that does is it ends up moving the cut position further left. So you're starting, I think it ends up something like 2 or 3 millimeters, the cut, when you get the fader out of the box. So for me, I wanted to get it down to, you know, something like 1.5 millimeters. So for me, I have to repeat this process quite a few times in order to get the cut to where I want it to be. So basically, you know, you do it once and then let go of the button at the end of here, and then you start again, move it to the B position, press and hold the button, move it over to A, release the button, and you just keep doing that, and it's just nibbling, I don't know, 0.1 of a millimeter or something like that off the cut distance until you get it to where you want. And then you repeat the same thing for the cut distance on this side. So you start at position B, press and hold the button, move it over, oh gosh, bad mouse control there, move it over to position C, then let go of the button, and repeat that as many times as you like until you've got the cut on that side where you want it to be. And that's about it for the setup. So last of all, it's basically put the back cover back on and put all of the screws into, you know, the audio interface and the cable clamp and all that kind of stuff from before. And that is about it. So for me, I personally like adding the, you know, the Innofader sticker and the nice Innofader knob. It's slightly nicer than the one that you get from Denon DJ. And that's it. So if you've got any questions, you know, leave some comments or whatever. I'll do my best to go and answer them. I hope you found this useful. Thanks very much.